So Bruce, you can just look at me the whole time.
Sounds good.
First question, if I could have you say and spell your first and last name.
Sure. First name is Bruce, B-R-U-C-E. Last name is L-Y-N-N, Lynn. And I'm the Executive Director of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum.
Where do you start to tell the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald?
Where do we start to tell the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald? That's a really good question. Of all the shipwrecks that we talk about at the Shipwreck Museum, I would say the Fitzgerald is the one that has the most what you could call sub-stories. There's a lot of different stories that could go in different directions. But I think really we could start, if we want to go back to the fateful trip that it took. That's probably a good starting point, because really that's what most people are wanting to know about when they come to the museum. So we could go back to November the 9th, 1975. The Fitzgerald is departing Superior, Wisconsin, fully loaded with iron ore. And by the way, Gordon Lightfoot does a fantastic job of summing up so much of this story. It's not all 100% accurate, but he's really close. But departed Superior, Wisconsin, fully loaded. There were some warnings that the weather might take a dramatic turn. The weather when they departed was fantastic, unseasonably warm, beautiful weather. But they knew that there was something brewing on the lake, and actually it was brewing in other areas and converging on the lake. The Fitzgerald ended up getting past an area called Two Harbors, Minnesota. Going in that direction, there was another ship that was pulling out of that port named the Arthur M. Anderson. And those two ships pretty much were, for the most part, together, if not within sight of each other. They were within radio contact of each other for most of the duration of this trip. And they both, because of the weather, and you had two captains talking to each other, two veteran masters of these ships talking to each other about what was going to happen with the weather. Should we alter our course, which ultimately is what they did. They took a more northern route to have cover from the lee of the Canadian shoreline. They made that northern trip. It was a longer route that they would take, but hopefully safer. They would get beat up a little bit less. They did that trip. They got closer to this end of the lake because they started in the western end of the lake. We're here at Whitefish Point. And this is the eastern end of the lake. They took a turn close to the Slate Islands that are kind of northeastern corner of Lake Superior, and started making that turn to head down to Whitefish Bay. And I think if they would have made Whitefish Bay, they probably would have been fine. They were getting beaten up a little bit more. The direction of the storm took another turn. The intensity of the winds, the size of the waves, everything else was increasing and becoming more intense. They were getting beaten up a little bit more. Ultimately, they got within 17 miles of Whitefish Point, 17 miles northwest. They had passed Michpicoten Island, they had passed Caribou Island. The captain of the Arthur M. Anderson had noted that they might have been closer to a shoal that was in that area that he would have wanted to have been. The Captain McSorley of the Fitzgerald had already acknowledged that he had a list they'd been taking on water. Vents had been damaged, allowing more water to enter the vessel. And he had also acknowledged that their radars were down. So to a degree, they were sailing blind.
He knew they were in trouble.
I think he had an inkling that they were in trouble. You know, for a captain to get onto a radio like that and acknowledge those problems, that was probably a good indicator that yes, there was something going on there. But he was only kind of giving a general idea. But they were also, he thought they were doing reasonably well, at least from the way he sounded on the radio. Captain Cooper of the Anderson had acknowledged that as they made that northern route, they made a good trip of it. They didn't have any, they weren't having seas that were boarding them or causing them any real problems until they made that turn and started heading down to Whitefish Bay. Snow squalls were coming and going. Again, the waves were getting higher, the intensity was growing, and within 17 miles of Whitefish Point, a snow squall kind of descended on this end of the lake, enough to obscure the vision of the crew, officers that were in the pilot house of the Anderson. They really couldn't see anything but the snow. But one other thing happened. As that snow squall lifted, they noticed that they couldn't see the Fitzgerald on their radar any longer at that point. They also didn't have visibility at that point. You could say that they had been breathing a sigh of relief, and probably still to a certain degree were breathing a sigh of relief because they knew they were this close to Whitefish Point in relative calm waters. They had made it. They were going to get through the storm, probably one of the more intense storms that they had ever seen. They even acknowledged that. But still, there was this nagging feeling, where is the Fitzgerald at this point? Again, we don't see her on radar. We can't see her lights. At one point, they thought, looking in the direction of the Canadian shoreline, that they had seen some lights. Those ended up being the lights of cars that were on that shoreline. They got concerned just enough that Captain Cooper radioed the Coast Guard, indicating he had some level of concern for the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Coast Guard, I think, had some difficulty taking that seriously, and they didn't really acknowledge it so much.
Why so?
Well, this is a 729-foot ship, and the Queen of the Lakes, a record-breaking ship, a big, stout, relatively new ship that was out there. And the idea that it could disappear that quickly didn't seem possible. And I would be willing to imagine that the crew on board the Anderson, especially in the pilot house, they were probably thinking the same thing. That ship is there somewhere, we're just not seeing it. And maybe our radar took some damage at the same time. Who knows what they were thinking? But I think they all probably thought that was still a little bit difficult to believe. Cooper was still having that nagging concern. He radioed the Coast Guard again. The Coast Guard did start to take it a little bit more seriously. And then there was some interaction between the Coast Guard and Cooper.
Is Cooper kind of saying, like, hey, I know this seems impossible, but like Captain Gut is telling me something's not right here?
I think that's a good way of looking at it. Yes, he had a serious concern, and he wanted to convey that concern to the Coast Guard. Eventually, the Coast Guard, after getting past a point where they were talking about a 16-foot boat or something that might have been out there with a couple of guys on it, once they got beyond that concern and started thinking seriously that there might be a problem here, then one of the things the Coast Guard did, and the individual that Captain Cooper was talking to, after a while, requested that they go back out and have a look and search.
This was be like an unfit. Like he's got to be sitting there saying, "You got to be kidding me."
You can tell by the tone of his voice if you listen to those radio transmissions that he was concerned, and he even, I think, made a reference to taking a hell of a beating out there if they go back out. I mean, he was risking his own crew, his own ship, to turn around and go back out. But at the same time, if that would have been the Anderson that disappeared off of the Fitzgerald's radar, and if they couldn't see the Anderson, I think Cooper probably thought, and rightly so, that the Fitzgerald rather would be actually turning around and going back out and looking for them too. There were other ships out there that night. There were other ships out in the Big Lake that night. One ship called the William Clay Ford of the Ford fleet did actually go out and search as well. There were a few other ships that went out as well, but they didn't get out there too long before they had to come back to Whitefish Bay. And one story that I think doesn't get told enough is a Coast Guard part of the story. Group Sioux was one thing. They had one ship that was out there but was not rated to handle conditions like that, so it didn't leave Whitefish Bay. There was another ship that was having mechanical issues, another vessel having problems. In the end, the Woodrush, a Coast Guard vessel in Duluth, got the alert. It was Monday night. A lot of their crew were watching Monday Night Football, and then suddenly they've got a scrolling message at the bottom of the television set telling them that if you're a crew member of the Woodrush, you need to report to your ship. And this is not something they wanted to hear. The weather was lousy over there too. And the idea of going there, they weren't sure what it was about, but they got there. They didn't even have a full crew. And under the command of Captain Jimmy Hobaugh, they ended up crossing the lake, getting to the last known location of the Fitzgerald. Off the top of my head, I forget how many hours it took them, but they didn't get there that quickly because, again, they had a long trek ahead of them.
I was going to say, it sounds crazy. You've got the Coast Guard of the Sioux, which seems so crazy, but they're going all the way to Duluth saying, can you guys give us a hand here?
They're crossing the entire distance of the lake, basically, to get to where the Fitzgerald was last seen. That is one of the stories that I think most people don't know that much about. One of the sub-stories, I guess, of this overall story of the Edmund Fitzgerald. But they did it. They crossed the lake. They made it safely. They did participate, to a certain degree in the search for any survivors, any remnants, or any wreckage of the ship. Of course, they didn't find the ship. They didn't find any survivors or even any bodies, for that matter. So, but they did make the trip, and that speaks to the captain and the crew of that vessel.
To back up a little bit further, why was the Fitz originally built and originally launched?
Sure. So, to ask the question, why was the Fitzgerald launched? Why was it built? Why was it launched? If we think about the era, steel production in the United States was booming at that point. The ship itself was owned by the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, which I think surprises people sometimes, an insurance company owning a ship.
One that we still hear of. Everybody knows who Northwest Mutual is even still today.
I would think so, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's maybe not a household name, but not far from it. But that wasn't super uncommon. They owned the ship. The ship was named in honor of the outgoing president of the company, Edmund Fitzgerald, the man. Part of the story goes that he had left the room for a few minutes, and the board of directors, in order to bestow this honor on him, they named the ship after him. I'm not sure. Hard to tell if he was, from what you read, whether he was super comfortable with that idea, but he did warm to it. And in some reports indicate that maybe after he accepted it, it was something he was really happy about and something very proud of. If that was something he was very happy and proud of, when the ship sank was probably one of the hardest days of his life. And this comes from other interviews that I've read as well. But no, this was a ship that was built to carry steel, carry iron ore, basically. It was built to be fast. It was going to have some of the finest appointments on board. If you were a crewman, you could be pretty happy, pretty proud that you were serving on the Queen of the Lakes, the Edmund Fitzgerald, one of the fastest ships, one of the newer ships that were operating, and it did break record after record after record. It was faster and it could haul more cargo, and so it was breaking these shipping records. It was designed to do it, and it did it. But it was also, no, I was just going to say it was also being the flagship of the Columbia Transportation Division of the Ogilvy Norton Company. It was the ship that VIPs would be invited to go on for a cruise. If you happen to know somebody who had a connection, either in Northwest Mutual, Columbia, Ogilvy, what have you, you could go on a cruise. And so it had passenger quarters on it as well. You see pictures of when they would be dining on board this ship, and it looked pretty elaborate, for sure.
So it was owned by Northwestern?
So it was owned by the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company. It was leased by the Ogilvy Norton Company through the Columbia Transportation Division. Okay. That's all very clear, isn't it?
Yes. For our purposes, should we just say it was owned by Northwestern Mutual, or?
That, or we could say it was operated by the Columbia Transportation Division. Okay. So the Columbia Transportation Division of the Ogilvy Norton Company, the reason I think it would be good to say that is one thing that really stands out is the smokestack of this ship. And if you look at the model, you have the star, you can see the C. Some people are often going to wonder, what's the C stand for? And we get questions like that, so, yeah.
She was the pride and in some ways the envy of the Great Lakes.
I think so, yeah, absolutely. Other ships didn't have the appointments that this ship had. I do think, again, it was a source of pride to serve on this ship. And we've had individuals that we've been in contact with that did sail on the ship. As a matter of fact, there was a gentleman I met with last summer who, the summer of 1975, he was a crewman on board the Fitz, and he wanted that to be the ship he was going to serve on for a very long time. In the end, the other crewman that he had replaced, who they weren't sure if he was going to come back, that crewman that he replaced did come back. And this gentleman did, I won't say he got booted off the ship, but he didn't have his berth any longer. He didn't have a place because this other gentleman came back. So he was pretty upset about that.
He had fallen to he was second on the depth chart, essentially.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to mention their names in this, but I'll just say this. Bruce Hudson was the deckhand that came back and replaced him. Bruce Hudson was the man that he had stepped in for when Bruce went away. Bruce was a young guy. He was an Ohio State student. He had this new Dodge Challenger waiting at the dock that he and his good buddy Mark Thomas, who was also a deckhand of the Fitz, were going to do a cross-country trip. These guys were regular guys, and they had dreams. They had plans for the future. But they also felt like they were pretty lucky to be serving on this ship at the same time.
Regular guys, but also as far as a shipping crew goes, a pretty A-list crew.
I would say so. Yeah, I would say so. I don't know exactly how they did that, exactly how they would pick, and I don't know what the process was. But yeah, I think that if you were kind of a lazy, shiftless crewman, chances are you weren't going to be on the Fitzgerald. That's my speculation there.
And so she's going in 1975, right? It's November of 1975 is kind of the tail end of another typical Fitzgerald record-breaking season.
Well, when we got to 1975, they weren't breaking as many records at that point. So I don't remember exactly what year it was, but the 1,000 footers came out, and suddenly you had a ship that was 1,000 feet long that could carry just an extraordinary amount of bulk cargo that I'd have to go back and look at the numbers, but the records that the Fitzgerald broke, if you look at the records that the Stewart Court, one of the first, if not the first of the 1,000 footers, if you look at the cargo that it was carrying versus what the Fitzgerald was, there was a pretty substantial difference. So she wasn't breaking records anymore, but I think to a certain degree she was still the queen of the lakes. She was one of the more elaborate ships, and again, I keep referencing those appointments, all stainless steel in the galley, all the latest technology that was on board a ship. The Fitzgerald, for the most part, had it.
So November 9th, 1975, she leaves Duluth?
Superior, yep, so you've got the right idea, but it was Superior she left, yeah.
And she's heading where?
So she was headed to a place called Zug Island. If you listen to Gordon Lightfoot's song, right?
He says Cleveland.
Right, that's right, and Cleveland fit those lyrics. How are you going to get Zug Island into those lyrics? So it doesn't really work that well, but Zug Island is ultimately where they were headed.
As far as weather conditions, November 9th, when they left Superior, they really, to the naked eye, it looked like a good journey, good sailing weather.
Yes and no. So the weather when they departed, again, it was unseasonably warm. It was always the reference I would see to it. It was just an unbelievably nice, sunny, and we've had those here. And then you pay for it like a week later, it seems like. But in the case of the Fitzgerald and the Anderson, but particularly the Fitzgerald, they paid for it on the 10th. But they knew it was coming. And, the Fitzgerald was even a weather reporting ship itself. So they had been trained to take weather readings. They weren't meteorologists per se that I'm aware of, but they would take weather readings and they would report those back to their home office. They knew it was coming, and that's why they chose to take that northern route. And then once they got to that northeast corner, the Slate Islands, that's when things really started to turn. And again, they'd had a bit of a rough ride, I think, but they did get some cover from that Canadian shoreline. But Anderson and Captain Cooper would talk about the angle with which the waves were hitting that ship as they started to make that turn and be heading to Whitefish Point. They knew that things were shifting a little bit with this storm, but they were also getting that much closer to Whitefish Point and Whitefish Bay at the same time.
Was this supposed to be their final run of the season, or were they going to have more?
It was their final run of the season, if I recall correctly. I'd have to check that to be 100% sure, but I believe that was the case, yeah.
When in the journey of the Fitzgerald did Captain McSorley start getting a sense, or at least what we can tell from radio traffic, did he start getting a sense that we're in a little bit of trouble here?
Yeah, so when they were closing on that turn, there were some interesting things that occurred that don't always seem apparent. But a lot of the radio communications between Captain McSorley and Captain Cooper on the Anderson, McSorley obviously on board the Fitzgerald, you kind of start to get an impression that McSorley was getting an idea that maybe something was going on with this ship. If you read reports about Captain McSorley, if you read excerpts or interviews that maybe from former crew, you might get the idea that maybe he wasn't a big fan of the Fitzgerald, but again, there's some speculation, I think, in there. I think there was a reference once that he had put forward that the ship maybe wiggled, if I believe that's the term he used, in a way that maybe other ships he'd been on didn't. But yeah, as they were closing in on that turn, at one point he slowed down. The Fitzgerald was the faster ship versus the Anderson, so he did slow down a little bit to let the Anderson kind of close up on them a little bit, theoretically, just in case. And some of the communications as they were closing in on that point where they were 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point, and when they disappeared, the discussions took place about the radar being down. He had a fence rail that was down. He'd been taking on water through a couple of events that had been damaged and that kind of thing. So kind of in that span of time, he's making this information public. So you do get the idea that he knew that something was going on. But other things that aren't readily apparent, they were a weather reporting ship, and they didn't send out a weather report at one stage in the storm as they were kind of closing in that area where they would turn. So it makes you wonder, we don't know, but were they dealing with some other problem that they didn't have time? Because really a weather report in conditions like that is pretty important to get out, especially for other ships that might be on the lake. So they didn't make that weather report. Makes you wonder why. Why? Was it just because they were dealing with other problems? So a lot of it, I think, we don't know, and it goes kind of unsaid. Yeah, they knew that something was going on. The crew on the Anderson knew there was something going on. Were they really worried about it? Probably not. They'd weathered some pretty dramatic storms in the past. Some references put Captain McSorley at being a quote-unquote heavy weather sailor. Maybe, but there's maybe some other reports that indicate not so much. Yeah, I mean, I think we try to extrapolate by researching these things and reading as much as you can, and you can look at the Coast Guard Marine Casualty Report, the National Transportation Safety Board Marine Casualty Report regarding the Fitzgerald as well. Some of those documents are more helpful than others, but in any case, you knew something was going on, and he certainly conveyed that on the radio.
And it was really around the northerly turn where things start going bad to worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, certainly with the weather, and we can extrapolate that from Captain Cooper on the Anderson, because that's where he referenced they had damage to one of their lifeboats that they didn't even know until they got into the locks. They had no idea that there's no way they could have launched that lifeboat. So a lot of that we start to get after the fact. And then if you look at the statements from Captain Cooper and his first mate, you can see some interesting things in there that maybe would make you think that they were maybe a little bit more concerned. But some of it also doesn't. It's kind of hard to tell, really. It doesn't convey as much, but some areas of it maybe give some hints.
When the search and rescue crews start going out, they finally get a chance at daylight the next day. Is that really the first chance?
Well, there were some aircraft that came in over the area, Coast Guard aircraft, to start searching. Like I said, the wood rush was coming from the other end of the lake. You even had a gentleman by the name of Jim McDonald. This guy's a hero, really. He's a Canadian, lives over at a place called Mamass Harbor. He's got his fish tug, his commercial fishing vessel. His story is amazing on that end of the lake. That even to the point where the water level changed so dramatically where they lived. He stayed on his boat the whole night because he was concerned about that storm, and even with his boat being in the harbor, that it might sustain some serious damage. So he wanted to be on it to make sure maybe if there was some problem, he could maybe negate part of that. But he made a reference that I thought was interesting, that the next morning, you could not imagine how calm that lake was. He said it was like I don't think he used the term mill pond, but he just glassy smooth, mirror-like surface after that dramatic, horrible storm the night before, and then the next morning it's like glass. And so I thought that is really fascinating to tell you the moods and the drama of that lake, how quickly it could go from this to that. But Jim's story doesn't really end there. They went out and searched as well. He had some communications the night before with the Anderson as well, so he was listening, monitoring this radio traffic. But they went out, they found numbers of life jackets, some of the inflatable life rafts, and I believe that he indicated they found one of the lifeboats. There were other ships out there at that point that were searching as well. So there was a lot of debris that they were finding out there that next morning.
Life jackets the crew never got a chance to.
Exactly. I mean, maybe some of them had them on, but we'll never know. If they had an inkling that, things were bad, maybe they would have put them on. But yeah, they recovered a lot of things like that.
Why do people still have such a fascination with this shipwreck 50 years later? Is it the Gordon Lightfoot song, or is it the fact that there were no survivors? There's no one to tell definitively what happened to the Fitz.
That's a great question. We talk about that a lot here at the museum. I think there's a variety of factors. Gordon Lightfoot had a huge impact on the telling of this story and putting this shipwreck, and maybe to a certain degree shipwrecks in general on the Great Lakes, into the public consciousness. Gordon Lightfoot, his song, I kind of made a remark earlier that it wasn't 100% accurate. There were a few little bits, but really, honestly, who cares? It's a great song. It tells the story really, really well and pretty accurately. But it also made people learn, whether they wanted to or not, about this ship called the Edmund Fitzgerald. Or in other words, people that might not have had an interest in shipwrecks, to start with, heard the song. It's a fantastic song. It hit number 2 on the Hot 100, Billboard Hot 100 in 1977, or I'm sorry, 1976. It made people maybe think a little bit about shipwrecks. And then if they thought about it more, shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. There's a historian and author, prolific author, historian, Fred Stonehouse, who was a presenter at the 40th anniversary Edmund Fitzgerald Memorial Ceremony we did here at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. And he said that in a lot of ways, the Edmund Fitzgerald has come to represent shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. And that is so true on so many levels. It is in many ways, it's the one that probably most people know about. But if you think of so many of the other shipwrecks on the lakes, and some statistics tell us 6,000 shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, some statistics tell us 10,000 shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, the Fitzgerald is really the one that they know about. Not everybody, but most people. And it makes people think a little bit about the dangers of operating, on the lakes that these ships would encounter, or even just commercial fishing vessels, passenger vessels, what have you. But going back to the question, Gordon Lightfoot certainly had a huge impact on the interest level. I would say the fact that this was a relatively new ship, it was the Queen of the Lakes, it was this record-breaking ship. There's so many elements of the story. The fact that the mystery still is there. Why did it sink? We don't really know. Multiple expeditions going down to the shipwreck, where in most cases, if not all of them, they came back with more questions than answers. Even Jacques Cousteau. People of a certain age grew up watching the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau. I did. And the fact that Cousteau's Calypso came up into the upper Great Lakes, came up into Lake Superior, went out into those Canadian waters where the Fitzgerald rests, and they put their submersible down on it. They came back with the idea that it probably broke apart on the surface before it sank, which a lot of people hold that theory today. I think it's kind of hard to believe, because you would think if it were on the surface, they would have any amount of time to get a distress signal out, possibly, who knows, but that's a theory. Other theories that there were 3 rogue waves, massive waves, that did end up hitting the Anderson and were headed in the direction of the Fitzgerald. Shortly after that, the Fitzgerald disappeared. Maybe that ship had been losing so much buoyancy that those waves drove that ship to the bottom. That's a theory, but they're all speculation and they're all theories. We just don't know at this point. So
it's all it'll ever be.
Exactly. I mean, because every year that passes, every decade that passes, that wreck site degrades a little bit more. I mean, it's not salt water we're talking about, but it does impact, that wreck site. Relatively new ship, the nature of that ship, Gordon Lightfoot, the mystery persists. And then there is a fascination, I think, with shipping and shipwrecks in general. Sometimes people like to make a comparison with the Fitzgerald and the Titanic. Other than the fact that they're well-known shipwrecks, I'm not really sure where the comparisons come in. I mean, the Titanic took kind of a while to sink, and the Fitzgerald disappeared really quickly, to the point where, again, they didn't have a chance to get a distress signal out. So I think all these things add together. People become fascinated with things like this, and in a lot of interesting cases, people kind of become emotionally attached to this story too. They hear the music, they read the books, they learn about the crew. Maybe it makes them think of a lost loved one. But we've had people that come here to the museum and they watch our video. We have a video that was made in 1996 about the raising of the bell, which took place in 1995. The Fitzgerald bell was recovered July of 1995. We still show the same video today. It's a shortened version of a Discovery Channel documentary. And it is every day we will see people coming out with tears in their eyes because of the stories that get told just in that video alone. I mean, we're not here to make people cry, but at the same time, if people are emotionally touched by this story, and shipwrecks in many cases are inherently tragic, then that tells me that the message is kind of getting across, that this is dangerous. All these lakes are dangerous waterways, and these crewmen are really, in a lot of cases, they were putting their lives on the line, and we saw what happened.
Guys, can I walk?
Yeah.
I'm about to sneeze my face off.
So here we are, 6 months away from the 50-year mark of the sinking. How should the crew, how should the ship be remembered 50 years later?
That's a great question too. I think the first thing we want to think about is the crew. The ship is interesting. The fact that, everything we've talked about, this record-breaking ship, and it was the finest of the fleet and so on and so forth. Pride of the American side. That is fascinating, especially for those of us that are boat nerds. But really, the 29 crewmen that were on that ship, that's what we gather to remember. We gather every November the 10th here at the Shipwreck Museum. We have different speakers each year that in many cases are connected directly to the story. But to me, the most important thing to do is remember those crewmen. And by virtue of that, remember all the sailors that are lost on the Great Lakes and passengers that were on passenger vessels and life-saving service crewmen that were out there trying to rescue people on shipwrecks. That's really the focus for us. We want to remember the whole story, but ultimately the crew is the part that we're there to remember.
Is there anything else we didn't touch on, or anything else people should know about the wreck, about 50 years later? In some ways, it's hard to believe it's been 50 years since the Fitz.
It is hard to believe, yeah. I can remember as a child, my family bought a cabin in the 1970s just south of Whitefish Point. And I'm pretty sure it was Walter Cronkite when I was a child, who it spurred a conversation with my parents about this ship that had gotten into trouble or perhaps sank on Lake Superior. So that's a memory that I have. And in researching a book that we published on the 40th anniversary of the Fitzgerald sinking, published through the museum, one thing that I did was a lot of interviews with people that had different connections. These connections could be indirect. It was, in one case, a gentleman who worked at one of what was the generator there at the Sioux Locks. And his recollections of that night and how all the indicators, the flow, I guess it was, of the hydroelectric plant, but all of the indicators were telling them that the weather was going crazy outside and what was happening outside of this massive building where the hum of the generators kind of blocked everything out. But they knew something was going on outside, and when he ended up departing that generator plant there at the locks, he almost got blown into what he calls it the tail race, but basically behind where the water outflows from the generator. He almost got blown into that. There was a chain link fence that prevented him. This strong gust of wind almost blew him into the river. And he survived, obviously, and he was there talking to us about it. I'm kind of rambling with this part, but there are so many people that have approached us and talked to us about they remember where they were, what was happening, what was the weather like. In one case, a tree being blown down in their backyard, windows being blown in Sault Ste. Marie. It almost makes you think about people of a certain generation that talk about they remember exactly what they were doing when JFK was shot. Or maybe in my generation, the Challenger disaster. You remember where you were when you heard these things, or 9/11 is another example. But for people in the Great Lakes, and particularly the Eastern Upper Peninsula, they remember where they were. It's another one of these kind of pivotal moments in time that people relate to, and they very much like to talk about it. We hear that all the time here at the museum. So it's part of these sub-stories that kind of just go on and on that surround this one story of this shipwreck. Maybe it speaks to that fascination again, what people have, either with the weather, the ship challenging the elements, or all these ships, and in this particular case, things didn't go well.
One thing that's interesting that I've discovered is that the families of the crew members didn't find out from the shipping company itself. They found out from radio, television, and newspaper reports.
So we have a lot of contact with a lot of the family members. Not all of them by any means, but sure, there are. You hear about those instances where in one case, Ruth Hudson, I mentioned Bruce Hudson a little bit earlier, she did tell me, I went to her home in Ohio and met with her niece, lady who comes every year now to our ceremony, but she talked about that is how she found out, was on the radio. I'm not sure that was everybody's experience, but it was certainly hers, Ruth Hudson's. And that's pretty shocking to think that was how they found out. I mean, who knows? Maybe the company was waiting to try to get more information before making that call. I don't know. That's a tough question to really comment on.
Anything else we didn't touch on, or anything else that we should hit on 50 years later?
I think we've covered a lot. Is this what you're looking for?
Yeah,
what
yeah,
we're talking about?
You hit every point that I was looking for.
Okay, because there's some details I don't always go into. And
No,
there's,
the Minnesota detail was great. Like, that's something I want to include. The fact that they were like, "Hey, Duluth, like, you're a day's sail away. Can you come give us a hand?"
Oh yeah, I mean the Wood Rush again is one of those. Somebody should write a book about that.
Yeah.
I mean, here's another thing too. There are so many books that have been written about the Fitzgerald, and I'll be the first to admit we published one at the museum as well on the 40th anniversary. But you know what I'd like to think with ours is just different enough. It's a coffee table book. We have so many images in our collections that really had not seen the light of day since they had been donated to the museum. We even created an exhibit. That one's since moved on, but we created an exhibit that highlighted a lot of those pictures. In many cases, those pictures were taken by ship enthusiasts that little did they know that when they were at the Sioux Locks in October of 1974, that they had their Brownie Instamatic, or they might have had their Yashica 35 millimeter camera. They were capturing pictures of the ship that, gosh, a year later would become the most tragic story in Great Lakes shipping. It boggles the mind. But we've built a book exhibit surrounding some of those stories of those people that were taking these pictures and then highlighting those pictures in the book. Because in a lot of cases, they're not professional photographers. But the pictures are fantastic. And they're so informal, but in many cases, we see things in those pictures that maybe we've never seen in a picture before. This may or may not be important to your story, but those people, again, they were kind of capturing a little bit of history. There's one gentleman who donated a number of pictures to us that he was a passenger on board the Fitzgerald. I forget, it might have been 72, 73. The man practically photo-documented this ship inside and out, right down to the tunnels below the deck, engine room, galley, the VIP passenger quarters, things like that. And this was right after I started in this job. And these slides rather show up in a box, and there was a note indicating, and actually this might have been a woman that sent these now that I think about it, that you're free to keep these if you want them, you can throw them out if you want, do whatever you want with them. But these were some of the most fantastic pictures I'd ever seen of the Fitzgerald before. So again, I'll go back to this idea that these are all sub-stories of this dramatic story that speaks to shipwrecks in general. I think the only other thing that I would add is that, and Corey's going to think I'm a broken record here, probably. I say this every year during our Fitzgerald ceremony, that we have to remember these other ships too. Dennis Hale, who was on the Daniel J. Morrell that sank in November of 1966, he was part of a crew of 29. The Morrell was a big steel ship that broke in half in Lake Huron and sank. He was the only survivor. Dennis was an interesting person. He would come up here every year to the museum. He would do a program. We'd fill this gallery up. He would talk about his ship. He would talk about his crewmen. But sometimes you would kind of catch a little bit of note of melancholy, maybe that's the right word to use, that people didn't know about his ship so much. People didn't talk about it as much. There didn't seem to be as much of an interest, and maybe he wasn't saying this directly, but maybe he was, that he would often be disappointed that there wasn't that awareness of those 28 of his really good friends, or some of his best friends. He called them his family, basically. Best family he'd ever known, and they perished in that shipwreck. Very dramatic story, but you just don't really hear about it that much. The Carl D. Bradley is another one, 1958, November, last trip of the season. They're getting ready to go home for Thanksgiving. The ship breaks up in northern Lake Michigan. 2 survivors on that one. But, a lot of shipwreck enthusiasts know these stories, and people are very familiar with them. There's books that have been written about them. But again, the general population, people just don't seem to have the awareness. If we go back far enough, and one thing we do at the Shipwreck Society is actively search for shipwrecks. That is something with the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society that I'd say that even though we have exhibits that speak to this, but the vast majority of people that visit have no idea that we do this. And some of these wrecks that we find have phenomenal stories, and in many cases there's a great loss of life. There's just not the awareness there. Gordon Lightfoot didn't write a song about those ships, so I think that has a lot to do with it. But those ships, if you think of the crew, say on the Western Reserve that we found last July, That ship sank in late August of 1892. August of 1892. We don't think of August as being a time of year where ships are getting into trouble, but it literally broke in half 60 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. The man who owned the ship, he was a sea captain himself, or he was a captain of Great Lakes freighters himself, had most of his family on board, including his young children. They were taking a summer cruise, late summer cruise, and the ship broke up and sank. There was only one survivor. Think about those people. Think about the kids. All of these people had family members at home. They all had loved ones. And if you think of the sailors, so many of them left massive voids, at home. They were the breadwinner. Mom was at home with the kids. People don't know about those stories. So in a lot of ways, that's something, in addition to being a place where people can learn more about the Edmund Fitzgerald, we try to talk to people about these other shipwrecks and these other stories and keep that memory alive. And a part of that is going out, searching for these wrecks when Mother Nature works with us and cooperates, because this year so far, 2025, we haven't been able to get out a whole lot. Our Director of Marine Operations, a man by the name of Daryl Ertel, and his brother Dan, they haven't gotten out a whole lot this year. They didn't get out as much last year because the weather just didn't cooperate. Weather impacts everything we do up here, but yeah, back to the main point. All those ships have stories, and in their own way, they're all a lot like the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Good.
Okay?
We're good.
Good. All right.
Appreciate it.